Hello and welcome. My name is Jamia Jowers, and I'm a security fellow with the Truman National Security Project and the president of the Chicago Refugee Coalition's Board of Directors. I want to begin by thanking everyone for joining us on YouTube for this very important program to discuss the global climate crisis and the importance of elevating the next generation of underrepresented environmental leaders. Now, just before we move into the conversation, I want to note that the Council is an independent and nonpartisan organization that takes no institutional policy positions. Views expressed by participants on the program are their own. And with that said, I'd like to welcome our guest, Vanessa Nakate. Vanessa began campaigning on climate issues in Uganda in 2018, and in just over 3 years has risen to become one of the world's leading climate activists. She is the founder of the Rise Up Climate Movement, which aims to amplify the voices of activists from Africa. Vanessa has been featured on the cover of Time magazine, been honored as one of BBC's 100 women, and recently spoke at the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow. She is also the author of an excellent new book entitled A Bigger Picture: My Fight to Bring a New African Voice to the Climate Crisis. I have it here and could not put it down. We'll place a link in the chat should you want to purchase it as well. Vanessa, welcome. Thank you so very much for being here today.
You're welcome. I'm so happy to be here.
Tell me, many advocates and activists have a defining moment. Tell me, what drove you to become a climate activist, and share with us what climate change looks like in Uganda.
Well, I remember in the year 2018, that was towards the end of my university, I started to do research about some of the challenges that the people in my community were facing. And at that point, I got to understand that climate change was one of those challenges, and actually the greatest threat facing the lives of so many people at that time. And it continues to be a great threat right now. So I decided to read more about climate change because in school I remember what most of us knew about climate change was it being the changes in weather conditions over a long period of time. But we didn't carry that experience of the realities that so many people were already experiencing because of the climate crisis. And some of the impacts that I was reading about in my country because of the rising global temperatures, it was the changes in the weather patterns that was causing extreme weather conditions in my country. And some of the impacts I had seen or I had read about were the landslides and the floods. For example, in the western part of my country, Uganda, in areas of Kasese, but also in areas of the eastern part of the country, in the Mount Elgon area. And I had read about how the climate crisis was impacting the lives of the people and destroying people's homes, destroying people's farms, and leaving many people with their livelihoods lost. My country, Uganda, is an agricultural country, and so many people depend on their farms for survival, especially the people in the rural areas. So a lack of rain means hunger, starvation, and death for so many people. While too much rainfall also means destruction of farms, it means destruction of homes, it means loss of livelihoods for so many people. So these are some of the impacts of the climate crisis that are already unfolding in my country. We also saw the rise in the water levels of Lake Victoria, that was in 2020, that encroached so many people's homes and left many people displaced in a time when people were trying to survive the pandemic by staying at home. So these are some of the impacts that we've seen from 2018 until now. The occurrence of floods and droughts and landslides continues in different parts of my country, Uganda. So when I realized that these impacts were happening right now, I knew that I had to do something about it. I had to become a voice in the climate movement and tell the story of the people in my community. And after being inspired by the climate strikes that were started by Greta Thunberg from Sweden, I also started to strike for the climate every Friday. My very first climate strike was in the first week of January in 2019. And from that day onwards, I've been helping to organize and mobilize different strikes and different reach outs in schools and communities to create as much awareness as possible about the impacts of the climate crisis in my country, but also across the African continent.
And when you first set out, what did you initially hope to achieve?
Honestly, when I first started, the climate strike, I was hoping to create awareness about what was happening in my country. And I was hoping to do that by sharing the strikes on my social media at that time and hoping that many people would share the message and see what the climate crisis was doing in my country. And to also be honest, I wasn't planning to do it for this long. I was hoping to do it until my time for graduation and then possibly study and do a master's or find a job. So I just found myself continuing to do activism because the problem became much bigger and bigger, and people continued to suffer because of the rising global temperatures.
We've had problems communicating the need for climate action here in my country. I'm keen to know, what are some of the challenges you faced in communicating the need for that same action?
Well, like I said, in school, many of us understood climate change as the changes in weather conditions over a long period of time, but we didn't carry the experience of what was happening on the ground or what was happening in people's lives or the destruction that was already taking place. So you could know the answer to give in the exam when you were asked the impacts of climate change. You would know that it causes droughts, it causes floods, it causes landslides, but you wouldn't know that it was actually happening. So some of the challenges that I've seen in my activism, it has been for people to accept that climate change is actually real, beyond what is in the books, beyond what is in school. It's actually real, and people are suffering right now. So it has been a challenge to make people understand that we are not exaggerating the climate crisis, but that the climate crisis is actually killing people right now and destroying the livelihoods of so many people.
I want to get into the heart of today's discussion and talk about climate change, the disproportionate impacts on the global south. According to the UN Environment Program, Africa is only responsible for 3% of global emissions. However, it stands out, it's disproportionately the most vulnerable region in the world. Why isn't this front page news?
Well, you're right when you say that Africa is responsible for less than 4% or for about 3% of the global emissions, and yet many Africans are already suffering, some of the most brutal impacts of the climate crisis. Like I've explained what is happening in Uganda. Many other countries on the African continent are experiencing extreme weather conditions because of the rise in global temperatures. We've seen the occurrence of floods, we've seen the occurrence of cyclones that have ripped apart large parts of the African continent. For example, Cyclone Idai that left over 1,300 people dead, and many more were recorded as missing. This was in 2019. And this year, we saw the tropical storm Anna still in southern Africa, leaving more than 80 people dead, and many more were left homeless, homes destroyed, schools destroyed, hospitals, power lines destroyed, and people left with no electricity. It was later followed on by Cyclone Batsirai in areas of Madagascar that killed people as well and destroyed property. We've seen, the locust evasions in East Africa that have led to food scarcity because the locusts eat whatever they come across in people's farms. We've seen the shrinking of some of the water sources like Lake Chad, causing conflicts in these regions because of the battle for the limited water sources. So the climate crisis is something that is already happening on the African continent. And while the African continent is on the front lines of the climate crisis, it is not on the front pages of the world's newspapers. And this is a challenge. This is problematic because if it is not on the front pages of the world's newspapers, It is possible for people's livelihoods to be destroyed without anyone knowing about it. It is possible for ecosystems like our rainforests, like Congo rainforests, to be destroyed, to be wiped out without the world getting to know about it. We believe that there is a need for people to listen to the voices, to the stories and experiences of the communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. We know that every activist has a story to tell, and every story has a solution to give, and every solution has a life to change. But this will be only possible if there is a platforming and amplifying of the voices of those fighting on the front lines of the climate crisis.
How does the legacy of colonialism exacerbate the effects of climate change? You previously said that we cannot have racial justice without climate justice.
It's evident that the climate crisis is deeply rooted into systems of colonialism. And like I've said, we can't have climate justice without racial justice. Many times we see that the communities or the people that are most impacted by the climate crisis are communities of Black people, communities of people of color, or indigenous communities. Like I've explained what's happening on the African continent and how we are least responsible for this crisis, but we are suffering some of the worst impacts of climate change. It's not only in Africa, it's across the global south. It's even in the global north. You find that communities of Black people are exposed to areas that are prone to air pollution, prone to water pollution. We've heard of incidences of the Flint water crisis that exposed very many Black children to poisoned water. We've heard of an incident in the UK of a young Black girl who died, and her death was connected to the pollution in where she was staying. So you find that many Black communities, Black families, find themselves in housing that is prone to pollution, be it air pollution or water pollution. They find themselves in residences next to coal power plants, where all this pollution and extractions are taking place. So it's evident that Black people, indigenous communities, many of these communities have seen their land being grabbed. They've seen their waters being poisoned because of oil spills. So it's evident that our communities are suffering some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. And it's also evident in a way that the people who are being impacted the most, the Black people or the indigenous people, they are not on the front lines again of the world's newspapers. No one is paying attention to their stories. Many Black people have found themselves in situations where they have been removed from conversations, where they've been cropped out of pictures, where their stories have not been platformed or even amplified. We saw the previous conference in Glasgow, COP26. I know many of the activists from Africa, they couldn't attend the conference because they couldn't access funding, they couldn't access accreditation, they couldn't access vaccines because of the inequity in vaccine distribution. So all these are deeply rooted in systems of colonialism. And yes, we can't have climate justice without racial justice.
Well said. It looks and feels pretty unjust when there has been this long-term inaction of wealthier nations and dare I say, of the largest emitters of CO2. So when you speak to Western audiences, do you sense a willingness to acknowledge this colonial past, or are they still in denial and expect Africa to operate under a system that's different from themselves, from which they've profited from?
Well, speaking from the perspective of something like loss and damage, which is already happening in many, countries in the global south, we saw that at the COP26, many of the vulnerable nations to the climate crisis were demanding for climate finance or a compensation fund for the losses and damages that are already happening in their communities because of the climate crisis. Yes, we know who caused the climate crisis and we know who needs to pay. We know who needs to release the money for loss and damage, so that people can be able, to come out of some of these impacts. When loss and damage happens, people cannot be able to adapt to it. So communities can't adapt to loss and damage. They cannot adapt to extinction. They cannot adapt to starvation. For example, we saw the Eastern Africa drought that left over 26 million people with no access to food and no access to water. People cannot adapt to starvation. But as we ask, the global north to pay for the climate crisis, to pay for loss and damage, we are still seeing hesitations. The loss and damage demands were only reduced to to a dialogue. We were demanding for a facility whereby money can be put for countries that are on the front lines of the climate crisis. But this was only reduced to a dialogue. So we see that the countries that are responsible for the climate crisis are still hesitant to pay for loss and damage. They don't want to acknowledge the loss and damage is happening now. They don't want to acknowledge that their actions cause the loss and damage. So there is still a challenge in seeing that things like loss and damage are acknowledged, are addressed, and are addressed, and that the funds, the necessary climate finance, is put in place for the communities on the front lines.
I agree. Climate justice must be actual justice in the truest sense of the word, which at its foundation is equity, must include both race and gender. And speaking of race, you already mentioned this earlier, you were infamously cropped out of a photo of young climate activists at Davos, an incident that was, truly symbolic of Africa's exclusion from the global climate conversation. What was your reaction when you first became aware of this, and how are you reclaiming your narrative?
Well, when I first saw the picture, at first I thought that I saw it on Twitter. So I thought that because it was shared on Twitter, it must have, become smaller. So when I decided to, click on the link and to read the article, unfortunately, the picture was was the way it appeared on social media, meaning that I wasn't in the picture, and even my name and my message wasn't included in the article. I remember my very first, of course, my emotional reaction was me feeling really hurt and, frustrated about what had been done. But my very first action and the thing that I wanted to know was why I had been cropped out. So that was my very first response, by quote retweeting the tweet that had been posted on Twitter to ask why I had been cropped out, because I felt like I needed an explanation for that. Because while at the press conference, one of the things that I really emphasized was the need to listen to every activist, especially the activists from the most affected areas, the ones on the front lines of the climate crisis. So it was really heartbreaking to see that I put this demand at the press conference, and the first thing I see on social media is a picture where I'm not included, but I can see a part of my jacket. So for that moment, I just needed to know why I had been cropped out, and it made me, understand the broader concept of climate change. For me to understand and for everyone else to understand that climate change is more than weather, it's more than statistics, it's about the people. And if the stories of the people are not listened to, then we can't have climate justice. If the experiences of the people and communities are not listened to, or they're removed from conversations and cropped out of pictures, then we can't have climate justice.
Absolutely. And while we're on the topic of marginalization, can you talk about how the movement to tackle an urgent global issue became so Western centric, and how this marginalization has undermined the climate movement's progress?
Well, many voices or many activists, especially from the global south, they face many challenges to have their voices listened to and their stories amplified. And this also happens with conferences. Because of the failures to get accreditation or to get funding, we always find, ourselves in situations whereby the conferences are filled with activists or communities from the global north, and there is no full representation of the communities that are on the front lines. And I think, makes us this really puts us in a place of moving backwards instead of moving forward. The ones whose stories need to be listened to are always left out of conversations, are always left out, of conferences. So how can we have climate justice if this is not tackled? And well, I think there is, the media, especially Western media, has much more bigger interest in the activists or the work of movements in the global north, which sidelines those who are speaking out from the global south. And also there is an expectation of how to organize, from media. For example, one of my fellow activists received an invitation to do an interview, and the journalist wanted to know how radical they are and any radical actions they have taken, because of their activism. And my friend asked, which radical actions are you talking about? And the journalist mentioned some of, the radical actions, and it was so global north, because again, some radical actions are privilege. It's a privilege for some people to take some radical actions. So the journalist decided that they wouldn't do the interview because my friend and fellow activist hasn't taken any radical action, in their climate activism. Even me myself, I found myself in, situations whereby I'm asked why I call, my activism climate strikes, and yet I am not skipping school. So even these narratives of how, we do our activism in our countries, in Africa or in the global south, they end up, erasing our stories. And yet it's not about the method that I'm using, it's about the message that I'm putting across. Not everyone is going to go to the streets, and it could be because of, the restrictions in their countries to protest. It could be because they cannot walk out of school. Maybe they're in boarding school. It could be because if they walked out of school, they could face a challenge of expulsion or suspension. And these are the things that, many people in the global north don't understand, that we won't do activism the same way. You won't see the large numbers that you want to see on the streets like you see in the global north because of specific reasons in our countries. But we have a way we do our activism. We have a way we create our awareness. It could be in schools, it could be in communities, it could be through the projects that we are, carrying out. So even, the way some of the journalists want to present a certain story, the global north story is not the global south story. We have different stories and we will tell them differently. But what is the key message? We all want climate justice.
Thank you for that. I believe, our listeners appreciate that. You talk about how many activists live in countries with governments that take a really hard line against those who strike or protest, or, where such actions could have severe repercussions for those involved. And so I appreciate you walking us through how young people in their countries can make their voices heard, and the support that we need to offer in that fight. I'd like to also just ask you a bit more about COP26. I saw your speech, and it was not only powerful, but a call for less talk and more action. And you and other activists have been, critical of world and business leaders for failing to meet these funding pledges and for weak leadership on climate action. But in that same breath, these same governments and corporations are very eager to engage with you, sometimes superficially, because it looks good, while not really listening to what you have to say. And so, how do young activists balance that need to work with those who have power without being exploited by them, because it's a delicate balance.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's a delicate situation for so many activists, especially when we are constantly asking for action, but we don't get it, and all we get is compliments. Like, young people are so inspiring. Young people are going to serve the world. But leaders calling us inspiring is not what is going to serve the world. Leaders saying that young people are going to change the world is not going to reduce emissions. It will be real action. And always we see that those kinds of praises are also followed by statements from leaders. But statements from leaders won't stop the warming of the planet, because they're always the same statements. They're always making commitments. They're always making pledges. They're always making promises about the things that they are going to do. But then it ends on paper. It doesn't go into action. So even those statements, they won't stop the suffering of people. Only real action will. If you ask the leaders whether they think that communities that are on the front lines deserve their help, deserve their action, they will quickly say yes. But the moment you ask them whether they will fund or put money for loss and damage, climate finance for mitigation or adaptation, all of a sudden there'll be a hesitation, from the leaders. So there is always a quick reaction from the leaders to say they're going to do this, they're going to do this. But then when it comes to the action, that is where the problem is. And we, as the people, we need to really mind the gap between the words and the actions, because sometimes we may get really carried away by the words. We may get so hopeful because of the words and fail to follow up on the actions. Commitments of the leaders will not stop the warming of the planet. Pledges of the leaders will not stop the suffering of people, and the promises will not stop the extinction of species. Only real action will do that. So many times, young people or young activists find themselves in that situation whereby, they're constantly being praised, they're constantly being asked, for pictures, but yet they don't get the action that they really need. So I think that is, one of the challenges that we see when it comes to the words and the actions that are followed up because of the leaders and their promises.
We have a saying here: put your money where your mouth is. So we really needed them to use their power for purpose. Let me also ask, over the generations, we can name, many global crises and many that have intersected. But now it seems young people are living in a moment of unprecedented intersecting crises, really that are accelerated by climate change, systemic racism, the pandemic, the erosion of democracy. We can go on and on. In your estimation, in your view, are these crises related? And so maybe I should put it another way. Should the energy that young people have devoted to these causes in recent years be combined, or must each of these crises be tackled in isolation? I mean, we know nothing is solved in a vacuum, but are we better segmenting these very complex geopolitical issues and then coming together, or combine them from the get-go?
Well, I think it's important for us to know that, all these crises or all these challenges that we are seeing, they are all rooted in one system. So it's like we are in one system. And if one part of the system is broken, then eventually the whole system comes crumbling down. So I think it's really important that we take an intersectional lens in working towards this crisis. I believe that they are all connected. I believe that everything is interconnected. That if we are a puzzle, or if this system is a puzzle, we may fit all the pieces, but the moment one piece is missing, that puzzle will never be complete. So as a system, or as a people, or as a planet, we cannot be complete if one part of the puzzle is missing. So we need all the pieces fitted in together for the puzzle to be complete, for the puzzle to look beautiful, for the puzzle to be perfect. And that will only be possible if we look at an intersectional lens in addressing, some of these issues. I always say, it's like we are in one house, and of course we are in one house, the planet. And if we are in one house and one part of the roof of the house starts to leak, many people may say, I'm in the corner of this, I'm in the corner of the room, and I am not bothered, by that leaking in the other part of the room. So it's those people in that room that should, in that part of the room, that should take care of that leaking. But then if all of us ignore that slight leaking in that part of the room, eventually the leaking will continue and continue and continue, and we'll find those little drops of water finally filling the whole room, and all of us will be impacted. So I think people need to see, like, we are in that room, that if we see a leaking in one part of the roof, then we fix it. Because if we don't, all of us will be impacted. So it is one system. All these crises are deeply rooted under the same system. So if we are to address everything, we have to address the system that has led to all these challenges. So I believe that, we should work in unity to, addressing, some of these, or all of these issues.
So let's talk next steps. Where do we go from here? Is it at major summits like COP26 where finally the climate movement will ultimately succeed or fail, and to your point earlier? Or will its fate really be determined by small grassroots groups, working at the local level?
Well, I'll start by saying we've had 26 COPs now, and we are still fighting for the same issues. We are still demanding for climate justice. We are still demanding for climate solutions. We are still demanding for climate finance after 26 COPs. So it's hard to say that the answer is in the COPs. Personally, I think the answer is in grassroots activism. I think the answer is in the mobilizing and the organizing in communities. I believe that is where we should look at for change. I could give, some of the examples. Some of my fellow activists are transforming their communities. They are bringing water to their communities where there was no water through their activism. They are bringing fruit trees to their communities. They are bringing skills development to their communities while organizing and still striking every Friday. They are bringing solar to their communities. They are transforming their communities from households to schools. So I think there is so much transformation that is going on in communities that many times is actually ignored. But if there was so much focus on what is happening, in the communities, and these activists are supported in transforming more communities, we realize that some of the challenges, like water scarcity, they start to phase out because a certain young person started a certain project to ensure that their community had access to water. So I believe there is so much change that is already happening, in grassroots activism. We've seen how indigenous communities, indigenous wisdom has preserved land and forests and ecosystems for hundreds of years. And the people, when we look at, corporations for afforestation, we often forget that some of their tree planting campaigns are going to affect indigenous communities. Many people are going to lose their land because of this. So why not put the focus and the protection of the rights of indigenous people who have been able to preserve our ecosystems for years, with their wisdom, with their knowledge? So I think that change will really come from the people on the ground, because we failed to get change, from some of these conferences. And if we are to get change from these conferences, then we need the people on the ground to speak on these conferences. But many times, the people who are already transforming their communities, They never get these platforms to speak. They never get these platforms to talk about the solutions that that they're already providing, in their communities. It can be because of funding or accreditation. So we need those who are already driving the change at the grassroots to be in these spaces, in these conferences. I believe that's where the change will come from.
And I would also ask, just real quickly, do you believe that in addition to the grassroots, that you would welcome, investments in climate financing, and what types of climate financing would be necessary for the adaptation and mitigation? I would think grants, right?
Well, when it comes to financing, I think that grants are very important. But the problem with these grants is the process to get these grants. It almost makes it look like they don't want you to get the grants. So the grants are complicated. The processes, the requirements needed are complicated. And the other thing is, some of these grassroots, movements or organizations, sometimes they don't have the legal registration that is, demanded for by some, of these grant givers or whatever. So I think there is a need for climate finance to go beyond the legally, put organizations, because there are many people who have tried to register their organizations, but they haven't been successful, again, for specific reasons in their countries. But they are already transforming their communities. So I think that, there is a need for finance to be made accessible, or for the grassroots organizers to be able to access this finance, because many times we hear that grants have been given, but the access to these grants is actually impossible. And many times we see, certain people announcing big grants or donations, but again, these donations go to already established organizations that have all the money in the ground, but in the world. But then those who are on the front lines, who need, they never get some of these funds to help them in the work that they're doing, maybe because their work is not known by the different people. So I think one of the biggest challenges in finance is the issue of access and the complicated processes of accessing these grants. But also to talk about the issue of climate finance in terms of loss and damage, when it comes to the vulnerable nations to the climate crisis, when we ask for compensation funds or climate finance specifically for loss and damage, we don't want it in form of debts. We want it as grants, because we don't want to add debt on already existing debt. So just to add something on the issue of finance as well.
Thank you for shedding light on that. I think, when we come up with these types of investments and financing grants, there's the best intentions, but the actual interworkings are the, red tape and the muddy that that is the disconnect between the actual funds and the receiver. As we close, I just would like to ask you if you could share a story from your work in Uganda, or from your experiences working with climate activists around the world, that gives you real optimism for the future.
Well, there are many experiences, but to share one of them, when we organize here, some of the things that we do is to go to schools and speak to students. But one of the things that I've seen so common when we go to these schools is that, because we speak to the different classes, different age groups, but most of the questions come from the ages of 7 to 10 or 7 to 9. Because when we are done speaking, we give room for the students to ask questions. But many times, the students with the most questions are the ones from 7 or 6 to 10. And I find that really beautiful because they feel like they need to protect their favorite animal. They feel like they need to protect their favorite tree because all of a sudden someone raises his or her hand and they say, I have to do something. I need to protect the giraffe. I have to do something because it's my favorite animal. And then the other will ask, what can I do to protect my favorite animal as well? So it's just those little things that really they really beautify activism, to know that the younger people really want to do something about it. I also remember one of the students asking what they can do practically. And remember telling them, speak to your parents and all that, but they wanted something that they can do practically, for the environment. And I remember asking the student whether they had a water bottle, and she said that she had a water bottle and she was so excited that she had one. And she started saying, I carry my water bottle everywhere when I'm with my parents, when I go to school, when I go to play. So she started feeling like she has been saving the world literally, and she needs to continue doing that. And again, the other thing that I've noticed is that the language changes, because when you're speaking to 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, you're not going to talk about 1.5 degrees Celsius. You're not going to talk about all these complicated terms when it comes to the climate crisis. All they need to know is that trees need to be protected. The lakes need to be protected. And when I use a plastic bottle, it's going to go into the lake, it's going to hurt the fish, and the fish will die. So they feel like when they have that water bottle, they are saving all the fish in the world. And as they grow up, because the next time we go and speak to them, they will be in a higher class, and the conversation will start to change, to more complicated terms that they can understand at that time, but something that was spoken to them when they were much younger, like they carried it, they believed that they can do something. And it makes me feel like even with that small action of a water bottle, and the child walking away feeling like they're already doing something, and just they're carrying their water bottle is saving the world. It shows how much even those small actions can transform the world. So I think that is one of the most beautiful things and hopeful things that I've seen in activism, that students who are aged between 6 and 10 feel like regardless they can still make a difference. They believe that no one is too small to make a difference.
Absolutely. Every one of us can make a difference, and it is our duty to do so. I could talk to you for hours, but I think we should open it up to our audience to ask questions. Okay, so I see here that we have a question from Bryce, and Bryce attends Whitney M. Young Magnet High School.
My name is Bryce Williams, and I just want to know how climate change is affecting urban versus rural areas in Africa.
Well, thank you so much for that question. Of course, the impacts of, climate change on the rural areas and the urban areas may be a bit different. And that's why we face so many challenges in talking about, the climate issues, because the people in the urban areas, it's like they are in their own personal worlds, and they can't look at what is happening beyond their homes, and they think that climate change is not happening. If you don't experience a flood, it doesn't mean that there are no floods. If you don't experience a drought, and you're able to have a meal every day, have a meal for lunch and supper, it doesn't mean that someone else there isn't struggling to eat because their crops dried up or they are washed away by the floods. So there is a difference in what is happening in the urban areas and in the rural areas. When you go to the rural areas, especially with the farmers, they know that something is changing. They may not have the name for it, they may not refer to it to it as climate change or the climate crisis, but they know that something is changing because they can recognize the weather patterns. They can tell that the patterns have changed, that when they used to receive rainfall, the months or the periods when they used to receive rainfall, they can no longer receive rainfall in those times. So it makes it hard for them to plan for the growing of their crops. And again, it's mostly in the rural areas where the floods impact people so heavily, because in the process, farms are lost and homes are destroyed and people are left to sleep in camps. However, the people in the urban areas, they have a roof, over their heads, they can have meals, so they will easily say you are exaggerating, the climate crisis, without looking beyond what is happening their houses. That's why it's important for people in the urban areas to look beyond their houses, to look beyond their schools. As you're going to school, another child can't go to school because the way to their school has been flooded, or because their school has been flooded by the extreme rainfall. So definitely there is, a difference in what is happening in the urban areas and the rural areas. And that's why when we carry out, community reach outs, climate education, the people in the rural areas, they can testify that indeed climate change is affecting them.
Great question, Bryce. Thank you so much. And again, Bryce is representing Whitney Young. I do see another question, and it is from Eric Saucer from Grinnell College.
Hello. I would like to know how you think we can incentivize private corporations to take measures to protect the environment, even when it would go against their best interests.
Yeah, I think that, there is a need for everyone, including private corporations, to do everything they can for the planet, and for the people. It's important for us to know that Earth is our home and it's a responsibility for all of us. And it's also important to know that climate change will affect all of us. However, some people are being impacted right now and being impacted heavily. But in the end, if nothing is done about this, everyone will be impacted by the climate crisis. Some people may be impacted directly or personally, but others, their children, may be impacted by this crisis, or their grandchildren, or the generations to come. So there is a need for everyone, including private corporations, to rise up for the people and for the planet. There is something that I always say that, many times activists leave their comfortable spaces to talk about these issues, to talk about the climate crisis. It is hard for many people to talk about what is happening on the ground. It can be heartbreaking, it can be emotional, it can be frustrating when you are talking about the impacts that people are going through. But many activists are leaving these comfortable spaces or their places of comfort to talk about the climate crisis. So it is time for everyone, for private corporations, to also leave their comfortable zones, because it is in us leaving our comfortable places that we will be able to address the climate crisis. Because if corporations will talk about net zero by a certain year, it has to actually be done and not just end in the words or in papers or in their reports. So the action is really needed. And the fact is, the action will be uncomfortable for so many people, for corporations, for governments, but it is much needed for all of us and for the planet.
Well said, Vanessa Nakate. Thank you again for being with us. It was a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you so much.
Indeed, we need to rise up and change lives. Her book, A Bigger Picture, My Fight to Bring a New African Voice to the Climate Crisis. Thank you to our audience for joining us today here on YouTube. As a reminder, this conversation will be available on demand on the Council's social channels and the website shortly. For more insight on critical global issues and diverse dialogue about what's happening in the world, and further, why it matters to people here in Chicago, in the United States, and around the globe, do take a minute to subscribe to the Council's YouTube channel. We hope to see you again at the next Chicago Council on Global Affairs discussion. Have a great day.